Hello and good afternoon to one of the final sessions of GPDRR. Welcome. My name is Loretta Heber-Girardet. I am the Chief of United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction's work on risk analysis, planning, climate change, and a variety of other things. It's a real pleasure to be with you all today. So today's session is called The Road to COP27, Scaling Up Joint Action to Reduce Climate-Related Disasters. And what we hope to do today is to really demonstrate how a layered approach to design and plan the implementation of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation integration at various stages before, during, and after disaster, but also really try to show how the experiences that we have in the field of disaster risk reduction can contribute to the global goal on adaptation work program, and also to scale up this joint action to build resilience to climate-related hazards. Now, before we get into the theme of today's discussion, let me please take you through some housekeeping. First of all, if you are watching online and you wish to follow the session in one of the 6 UN languages, you can select the language channel in the box to the right of the video window. And it's very important that you mute the audio from the video player, otherwise you will actually hear the original language. And there is a short video on the reception page that explains how to do this. In today's session, we will be using Slido to take questions from the audience. So please do connect on slido.com, and I hope you have, yes, the number 1914142, that's the code. Use your mobile phones to do that, and please insert the code. And for those of you following us online in Hopin, please access the tab Polls and Q&A on the right-hand side. If you're having any trouble, raise your hand and one of our technicians will support you. And if you're using Hopin, please contact the online support team via the chat box. So let's jump in. The recent IPCC reports and UNDRR's Global Assessment Report has made it abundantly clear that climate impacts will further intensify, requiring us to really transcend beyond these conventional institutional silos and really recalibrate the way that we're working. We need to collectively get ahead of climate and disaster risk, and this means that we really need to work better at ensuring the interoperability of our interventions and better connecting the people, the initiatives, and the approaches that we are working on. We are on the 3rd and final day of the global platform, and this need to break down silos and better integrate DRR and climate action has really been one of the overarching themes of this conference to emerge. Overcoming this fragmentation is particularly urgent on the question of adaptation in DRR. We know that in many of the countries where we operate, around 90% of disasters are associated with extreme weather events, which are getting worse, obviously, by climate change. And I was speaking to one of the panelists yesterday in one of the sessions who said that in his country, there is an 83% overlap between the DRR strategy and the National Adaptation Plan. Operating in separate silos is going to slow down progress, waste resources, and lose opportunities to really join efforts to reduce vulnerabilities to the wide range of risks, not just climate, but non-climate related risks as well. Now, when it comes to adaptation, which is very much the theme of today's discussion, there really is a concern that adaptation is not receiving the political attention that it deserves, not unlike DRR for that matter, nor is it really attracting the levels of financial investment needed to meet the scale of the challenge. The Paris Agreement, as we know, established the global goal on adaptation to increase the implementation and financing of national adaptation activities. And progress was made last year at COP26, which established the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh Work Programme on GGA, the global goal on adaptation, that outlines elements of the GGA. So this includes enhanced adaptive capacity, strengthened resilience, and reduced vulnerability to climate change. But what does that mean practically? What is that goal for adaptation? So today's session will really draw on the expertise of our panelists who are working on the front lines of disaster risk reduction to help inform these global discussions. As we proceed towards accelerating action on disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation, we really want to better understand the experiences in the disaster risk reduction community. And we'd like to answer the question, what should be the basis for setting goals and success criteria in the context of comprehensive disaster and climate risk management to develop the most effective pre- and post-disaster actions and ultimately to build long-term resilience? So I'd like to introduce you to our panelists. We have, starting on my right, Yusuf Nassef, who is the Director of the Adaptation Division of the UNFCCC. Victoria Salinas, who's the FEMA Deputy Administrator from the United States. And Judith Kaspersma, who's the Head of Department for Flood Risk Management from the Netherlands. Panapa Nanan, also known as Amy, who's the Director of International Cooperation from the Department of Disaster Prevention and Mitigation from the Ministry of the Interior in Thailand. Zita Sabasfari, who is the Deputy Director of the United Nations University's Institute for Environment and Human Security. Gerno Laganda, the Chief of Climate and Disaster Risk Reduction Programs at WFP, and Raissa Urea, who's from Jeune Verte, Togo, and is a member of GNDR. So, to start us off today, I am very happy to give the floor to set the stage to Mr. Yusuf Nassef from UNFCCC. The floor is yours, Yusuf.
Thank you, Laurie. Thank you for this very insightful introduction to the topic and for partnering with us in this event. I'd like to first recall the tagline for this conference, from risk to resilience. Now, we're very good, or have advanced considerably in trying to understand risk, to understand the quantification of risk, how we measure it, and even now using frontier technologies to understand risk even better. But what about resilience? How are we doing understanding what level of resilience is sufficient or desirable? How do we determine how much improvement in resilience or in adaptive capacity is sufficient, or how much reduction in vulnerability is sufficient? This is really the topic of this event, as you kindly mentioned in your introduction, and is also the main crux of our discussions under the new work stream under UNFCCC on the global goal on adaptation, which was set by the Paris Agreement, Article 7.1. And it seems like a benign question, you know, what level of resilience do you want to achieve? But once you dig deeper, you find all kinds of methodological complexities that we'll have to deal with as we move forward. What is the unit of measurement for your level of resilience? What are the trade-offs? What are the optimizations that need to take place? And some of these come in the form of intertemporal trade-offs. Maybe there is some balance between goals set for the short term versus goals set for the long term. There might be multi-level trade-offs. Is resilience at the national level an aggregation of resilience at subnational levels? Is global resilience an aggregation of resilience at national level? The answer in some cases might be yes, might be no. And we really need to get to the bottom of this. Trade-offs spatially between a country and its neighbors. Maybe resilience of one country entails an increase in vulnerability in the neighbors. So it's like a beggar thy neighbor approach to resilience. So how do we deal with all of this in trying to ascertain what should be a global goal on resilience? And there are many ways of looking at it. One of them is to look at thresholds of ambition. So for some, maybe the goal would be to make sure or to ensure a minimum level of basic needs in the face of disasters or in the face of climate change. And for others, it might be undoing fully the impacts of climate change. If you go higher up, it might be ensuring the attainment and sustainability of the Sustainable Development Goals, for example. You go beyond that, it could be to ensure under climate change the implementation of a country's aspirational transformation to a different level of sustainability or of development. So all of these are factors that will become relevant in the methodological discussions of how can then the negotiating process approach this piece on determining what should be a global goal. There's a balance between subjective, context-specific cultural components of determining where you want to be versus the objective, very hard data-based components. And so the event here is not really about actions that are taken or have been taken as much as how the aspirations have been set. Some of these aspirations, as we will hear here, have come as a result of experiences of a massive event that got a government to think about a longer-term policy with specific objectives in mind, and we need to know what these objectives are or how were they developed. And so I really look forward to hearing the insights from the DRR community. And there's a lot of measurement going to take place in the context of the MTR, the midterm review, that will certainly be very useful for how we approach the indicators and targets that could become part of the global goal, and how these feed into what we call the global stocktake, which is the 5-year assessment of progress within the climate change process. So with this, it's more about a collective intelligence process. We'll think together about, as we move forward, how one can address this goal-setting exercise, especially within a scaled-up thinking globally on what resilience means. What does it mean to be adapted? So thank you once again, Laurie. Thanks to everyone who's here. And looking forward to hearing all the insights from the podium and from the audience. Back to you, Laurie. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yusuf. Indeed, it is an incredibly complex issue, and the best way to really tackle it is by learning from the past. And so what we are going to do now is hear from several governments that have representatives of governments that have tackled major emergencies, that are tackling emergencies, and to better understand how have these past disasters really helped them determine goals, the goals that they have set for themselves to prevent and manage future disasters. How are disaster risk management decisions being taken, including how are you deciding the appropriate or a mix of approaches? Probably it's not just one approach, but what is that mix of approaches that you're pulling together to help you better manage these? And then how are you determining whether the progress that you're being achieved is effectively measured? So how are you measuring progress? So I'm very happy to introduce Victoria Salinas once again from FEMA, Deputy Administrator of USA, to tackle this first question. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you. So to your point earlier, Loretta, about silos, in the United States, one of the ways we've historically tried to tackle disaster response, resilience, recovery is through a lot of different plans and structures that help us organize and work together. And FEMA's mission is very much to help people before, during, and after disasters. That has led us to over 32 emergency management constructs. That's a lot. And so as we have tried to, with our partners, we've tried to really understand everyone's roles, figure out how we partner together, understand communities' needs. But as we look at the future impacts, the current impacts of climate change, we've really recognized that we need a different approach. And one of the things that we're actually working on in the pre-disaster space right now is moving from what our current state is of a framework on prevention, a framework on hazard mitigation, a framework on protection, and moving towards a national resilience framework, recognizing that there are gaps when we're looking at community resilience. My colleague here, Yusuf, spoke a little bit about the complexity of resilience, but one of the big recognitions is that we'll need to organize differently in order to have a more community-centered approach to investing in resilience as a nation. when we look at risk assessment as well, understanding risk is such a fundamental part of therefore reducing risk and building resilience. And we've put a lot of effort as a nation into making it easier for communities to understand their risk. Many people use our HASIS tool that's online. We have a national resilience index that can be used to look at historical data and understand risk. We have all kinds of guides for individuals and families and communities to reduce all kinds of weather-related and other natural hazards. And those have been useful, but we're also recognizing that it's not enough when we're talking about the changes that are in front of us. And so our pivot is towards making it easier for communities to plan with future conditions in mind, and looking at how we take these global climate models and empower local governments to make land use decisions and infrastructure investment decisions. And this is all in the pre-disaster space before we ever get to the point of an actual disaster. And we're also very much focused on building capacity. So typically in the United States, we have certain national capabilities we're trying to help our local governments build. And they're very well articulated, from a housing capability to fatality management. But as we look at building resilience and building the ability to be resilient in the face of climate change, we're also taking a fresh look at what are those conditions of well-being that every community must be able to tackle. And for the United States, with the Biden-Harris administration, we're very much focused on equity as a cornerstone of disaster risk management and climate resilience. And so what that can look like is making sure that, for instance, one condition of well-being might very well be every community, every person can be self-sufficient for 72 hours, regardless of what happens. But that's going to look very, very different for a person and a family with fewer resources than an affluent family. And so those are some of the changes that we're trying to make in the before a disaster space. During disasters, and this is something that has been a great focus of ours in the last year, is starting to use social vulnerability information and data to drive how we actually respond. And so what we've seen, whether it's been in recent tornadoes or floods, is equity as a tactic, and making sure that whether it's figuring out where we're putting debris, that it's being done, making sure we're not inadvertently creating more environmental justice issues. We're looking at how we actually send people out to support disadvantaged communities first, using data to really drive our operations in a way that focuses on equity. And why that's important to the climate change conversation is because of that overlap we all know that exists, that you referenced in terms of vulnerability, where existing vulnerabilities really in communities it's the same people who are oftentimes most disproportionately impacted by disasters. In the recovery space, after disasters, we're also making some substantial strides to really think about climate adaptation. And so while we've had programs where you could invest in hazard mitigation as part of rebuilding, it's become a greater priority. And every single opportunity that we have to partner with local governments and state governments to drive risk mitigation as part of rebuilding, we're taking. And so that's another big focus of ours as we're really trying to look at all those opportunities to build resilience into the work. And one of the reasons it's so important from our perspective is that while history can be a great teacher, unfortunately, when it comes to the moment in time that we're in, it doesn't have the answers for the future. Mm-hmm. And I'll give you one example from Houston, Texas. And so 1 in 500-year events should be pretty rare. In Houston in 2015, we had the Memorial Day flood, 11 inches of rain in 3 hours, 6,000 flooded structures, 7 fatalities, 1 in 500-year event. 2016, Tax Day flood. We like to name our floods according to the day. 12 to 17 inches of rain, 12 hours, 10,000 structures flooded. Again, a 1 in 500-year event. The next year, Hurricane Harvey, 47 inches of rain over 4 days. So this is why for us it's so critical to empower local governments and communities to understand future risk, because we're not going to be able to manage any extreme event because they're just too frequent. And that's a whole different approach to how we do emergency management, because there's the big events, the 1 in 500s, but as we all know, there's going to be more frequent low-level events where the federal government won't be involved. But that doesn't mean that at the most local level, our public safety officials, our emergency management, our neighbors, community groups, they will be the first line of response in all other disasters. And investing in that capacity is going to need to be a priority if we're going to handle the challenges ahead.
Thank you so much, Victoria. There's a lot there that you talked about, but I think this message that we are actually experiencing very frequent extreme events is something that many of the countries we know is grappling with, and the idea to really invest in capacity to be able to manage that is just critically important. Thank you again. Our next speaker is Panapa Nanan, who is the Director of International Cooperation from the Department of Disaster Prevention and Mitigation from Thailand. Please, the same question to you, please.
Thank you so much, Loletta. I'm very honored to be here with the other distinguished panel. Well, you all probably know that Thailand experienced the mega flood back in 2011. And of course, you know, we are in the disaster risk reduction, we are setting goals according to the past experiences. But frequently, the past experiences doesn't really qualify us and prepare us for the climate change and adverse effect of the climate change anymore, because we rarely can predict what's going on and what will happen. So in Thailand, you know, every single disaster or event, even the Tham Luang incident where the soccer player was trapped, were reflecting a new measure and a new way of how we do business. Thailand, we used to think about only disaster response, and now we move from disaster response to disaster risk reduction, and now we're moving toward resilience. So those are the things that we are moving forward to and trying to make. In Thailand, there's 3 factors that we actually contribute to our adaptation to the climate change as well as disaster risk reduction. The first one is the policy commitment at the high level. So the climate change and disaster risk reduction are at the highest national agenda. The second one, we have integrated the climate change adaptation and also disaster management, disaster risk reduction into our national social and economic development plan. You know, our National Social and Economic Development Committee also agreed that, you know, those two cannot be taking apart from each other, and it's always reflecting each other. And those will set goals for each of the action of each of the line ministry and element down to the village level on that we need to report to and need to have the certain goal and measurement that we have to follow. And the third one is the capacity development at the local level. You know, we are setting down to just the local level, just like the representative from FEMA was mentioning that, you know, capacity building at the community, capacity building at the individual level is very important. In ASEAN, we are promoting the anticipatory actions. So those are the measure and framework that we are trying to incorporate it into our national framework. We are adopting the self-sufficiency economy so that people can be individually resilient and also reflecting back to the central government. We are collectively building a strong community, strong individual to be able to battle the disaster as well as the climate change adaptation. We have a couple projects that, you know, at the down at village level, there's supposed to have the retention area for the water, not only for drought, but also for flood. There's actually supposed to be like at 2 retention area for each village. And those are reportedly back to my ministry so that they can follow up. So it's basically that's forced them to finding ways to mitigate their own risk. And each of the provinces and community now has to do their risk assessment. Each of their risk assessment as well as the disaster response plan will be different down to the village level according to their risk. Before 5 years ago, there's nothing like this. It's always copy and paste, down to like national plan, down to provincial plan and local plan. But now it makes mandate that each of the level of government, you have to have a different disaster response plan according to the risk assessment. And if they don't do it, my executive will just point them out and sell them out at the national floor, and no one wants that. And that's actually reflecting on the cutting on the budget that they will receive. I think to not only have plan, strategies, framework, but also have means for them to actually implement those at the local level and build resilience. So I'm just going to cut it short right here because there's a lot of things to talk about, but basically you need to have the whole of society approach. Every level of the society need to be aware and have the capacity building project to build their resilience and their adversity, the vaccine for actually disaster in the local level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think it's really fantastic to hear now the emphasis on understanding risks at a local level and developing plans that are specific to that locality rather than, as you say, copy and paste. But also the other point you raised, which I think we cannot emphasize too much, is around political commitment. It's really at the core of much of this work. So I would like to now turn to Judith Kaspersma, who is the Department Head on Flood Risk Management from the Netherlands, which certainly can teach us a lot about how to manage water and floods. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy and honored that I can speak here today on behalf of the Dutch Ministry of Infrastructure and Water. I would like to say something particularly about the first question of this session, and that is how have past disasters helped determine to set the goals and to prevent and manage future disasters? And I want to illustrate that with our history of flood risk management in the Netherlands. Our incentives for DRR investments in the Netherlands can be described as a continuous response and adaptation to the disasters that we faced in the past, I think. We often only acted when disaster had struck. After the 1916 floods, we built the Afsluitdijk. I don't know how to translate that exactly, but it's the levee that closed the so-called Southern Sea. And then after the floods of 1953, we built the Delta Works, which were finished only in 1986, which is an elaborate flood defense system. And then after the floods of 1995, we started our Room for the River program, giving much more space for the water from our rivers in the Netherlands. And then another incentive was the increased population and economic value behind our levees, our river levees, since the 1960s. And we developed a new system for the assessment of flood risk based on our national goal of a basic level of safety for everyone, meaning that the chance that individuals die as a result of a flood should not be higher than 1 in 100,000 years. An additional safety is built in at locations with a high number of possible victims or large economic damage or severe damage as a result of failing vital and vulnerable infrastructure. And the goal behind that is to lower societal disruption. However, currently we are confronted with the floods that happened last summer in Germany, Belgium and the Netherlands, and the emerging debate there is whether this event can actually be considered, well, bad luck, being a very low probability event, or whether it results from non-linear interactions in a climate and that may have substantially increased the probability of such extremes. Well, much knowledge and capacity to be built there. We're in the middle of the research on this, and actually the way forward is not yet known. We need to learn how to deal with these phenomena. And to deal with these situations of deep uncertainty, we can use an adaptive approach, which we have also used for our Delta program. And that's based on making decisions as the conditions change before severe damage occurs, and as existing policies and decisions prove no longer fit for purpose. I think an important part of our flood risk management strategy in the Netherlands is also our financing regulations for water management. In the Netherlands, water management and our infrastructure are financed in a special way. We have a special tax levy for the water authorities who are elected separately in their own democratic elections. This is a very old institution from, I think, the 1200s. And the water authorities have their own legislative authority to levy these taxes. And then apart from that, at the national level, we created the independent function of a Delta Commissioner who advises the Parliament independently of the government. So we make sure that our water management is always secure because, well, our country depends so heavily on that being in order that we really need to do that, because otherwise there would be no Netherlands. Also, the finance of our Delta plan is regulated through a separate law, which is the Delta law. And again, this is because our government thinks that water management is so important that it should not be depending on financing based on elections. Then maybe something about the financial funds for the Room for the River initiative that's controlled by the Ministry of Infrastructure. And it has for the coming 13 years an annual budget of approximately 1.3 billion euros. And this comes from the national government. And besides that, other layers of governance, so municipalities, provinces and the water authorities, they contribute through their own investments and research to the Delta program. So through co-financing, we protect our country. And the government provides a continuity of finance in adaptation, innovation and maintenance. And then the structural investments from this public money ensures also the creation of new jobs on the way. What have we learned from our Dutch experience? I think as a vulnerable delta, we learned how to deal with the risks, not by fighting water, but by living with it and to build with it. And climate change also taught us that we need a new strategy, a strategy with more integrated solutions, which is also part of the global goal on adaptation. And instead of fighting the water and building higher defense structures, we actually gave the water more space, because otherwise it was simply not possible to stay in the country. So an integrated and participatory approach that combines flood protection, landscaping and improvement of the environment, all making us more resilient. Another lesson that we learned the hard way is that we really need to learn to work together. And I think a strong asset of the Dutch water sector is that government, private companies, knowledge institutes and NGOs work together. And this is, you cannot succeed without doing this. And an integral approach, again, is key in the water sector, and it's also needed to break down the silos between the different groups that are working on this. We have gained our experience in this field through trial and error, and I really want to stress how much time it took for us to learn these lessons. But on the positive side, it also means that all the errors that we made, other people don't need to make that, because we can learn from each other. We learned that adaptation is an urgency and also an opportunity for a more sustainable and a more resilient world. We know that 90% of all climate disasters involve water. Water is the springboard, and it creates leverage for climate action and sustainable development. And for that, we need to involve all stakeholders, integrated approaches, develop new partnership, and develop a true long-term strategy. Yeah, I would like to leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Too much water, too little water, and how we manage it really requires integral approaches, to be more resilient, multi-stakeholder, bringing on board the private sector, amongst others. So thank you very much for sharing those experiences. We're now going to go to some insights from our stakeholders. But before I do that, I would like to remind you that Slido is available if you would like to ask any questions. We've received a few questions so far, which is great, and we'll go to these in a moment. The number again is 1914142. So any questions that you'd like to put to the speakers, please do it through Slido. So, as we have heard, we are here today to learn from past experiences that will inform the efforts underway to define the global goal on adaptation. I'd like to go to Dr. Zita Sabaswari now, the Deputy Director of the United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security. Please share some of your insights and reflections on how we can best define the global goal on adaptation based on our learning to date.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure. So I have a pleasure to look a little bit into the globalness of the global goal and adaptation. So what is global means? Is it a global ambition? Is it about global investment into adaptation? Is it about global responsibility, global learning? And I would like to draw your attention to one topic which I haven't seen much discussions around, but I think it's essential, thinking about global commons and potentially tipping elements of our Earth system, and how do we think about them in the context of the global goal and adaptation. So adaptation has been seen for a long time as a more local process because it's very context specific. So there are some global aspects around adaptation which are really needed to receive more attention. If you are thinking about the global commons, those are, for example, the deep sea, the ocean, but also the space and the Antarctic and the atmosphere. So those are the global resources which adaptation responses in certain countries, member states, could have an impact on, and that would constrain adaptation options of other nations. So we do have a special look on those resources. If you allow me just to expand a little bit on the ocean. So there is an international law of the ocean which governs some aspects which needed to look at it, but not necessarily in an extent which would allow us to factor in adaptation in a very, very good way, but that would be a vehicle to look at. But if you are thinking about extractive work such as dredging for sand or fishing, and to do so in a way that one nation would see, for example, fishing offshore in a large extent as one way to raise access to food resources, which would definitely constrain adaptation options of others. But the same also with space technology. So we heard a lot about warnings that if we actually go on in the same speed by launching satellites, we are completely crowding the space. But this is an important element of early warning systems, so Earth observation products and so on. But it's a global common where we need to take a look when we are looking into adaptation, and no one would probably do so if we would leave adaptation just at the local and at the country level. So those are elements I think we have to pay attention to. And finally, I would like to talk about those potentially tipping elements of our Earth system, like the Amazon rainforest, the Great Barrier Reef, boreal forest, which I usually talked about in the context of mitigation. So in the context of if we are continuing business as usual, emitting, those systems will be tipping and will also lead to cascading tipping points and will change our Earth system considerably. But there's also an adaptation component in this, because if we are thinking, for example, about the Amazon rainforest, it's not just global warming, it's also our land use change actions and the supply chains which are related to those land use change actions which need to be looked at. And that's, again, wouldn't be covered if we would look into adaptation just as a national priority. So this is one part of the answer to Yusuf's questions at the beginning. So is aggregation, if we are aggregating adaptation at the local and national level, if we are getting to an ultimately resilient Earth system, so my answer would be no. This does have, so to say, a layered approach, and some of the elements needs to be taken care of globally as a global responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zita. We have also been hearing over the past several days at the global platform about the food security crisis that is worsening every day. So I would now like to turn to Gerno Legando, who is the Chief of Climate and Disaster Risk Reduction Programs at the World Food Programme. Gerno, what insights can you draw on the discussion today related to your own experiences, and what do you see in terms of how we can best define the global goal on adaptation?
Thank you, Laurie. Thank you also for the invite. I think it's great to have a panel where the humanitarian sector is also invited. I must say that quite naturally, I think we are challenged with the prospect of a global goal of adaptation, because we look at the well-being of the planet and its people through the prism of food security, right? And when you look at how hunger in the world has evolved over the past decade, we have been on a pretty good track up to, I think, 2015 or so, when hunger numbers every year were going down. They were never going into the direction of SDGs, zero hunger by 2030. That was always a challenge, but at least they were trending down. And then there was a trend reversal, and you all of a sudden saw hunger numbers increase. At the beginning, slightly, because of this interplay between climate and conflicts. And then after COVID-19, after the war in Ukraine, now we see increases in these numbers that are very abrupt and that are faster than anything we would have imagined. So just in comparison, 2019, we had around 135 million people in acute food crisis or emergencies, and now we're talking about more than double, so 276 million people. So, of course, this is not only climate related, it's an interplay between economic factors, economic disruptions, inflation, food price inflation, climate extremes, and conflicts. But climate in this picture is a really important risk multiplier. And so the first aspect that I think we need to bring to bear, also getting back to the idea of having several thresholds, is, if people have nothing to eat, they cannot adapt. This is for us the minimum baseline condition that needs to be met for a global goal on adaptation. I think we need food security as a central metric in this conversation, and we should really define goals like no climate-induced famine on our watch in the world. Very simple, but again, we cannot expect that people adapt if they do not know how to feed themselves and their families. That said, I think there are certain interesting experiences. We have heard, I think, several times on the panel today, that rather than assuming that people look into climate models, or the governments look into climate models and then make an adaptation decision, and at the end of that they have adapted, adaptation is a very iterative process. It requires systems that are able to absorb risk information as it becomes available, and then respond to that risk information with adjusted course of action in different sectors. So basically the availability of these iterative risk management and risk analytical systems, and maybe their universal application could be one of those aspects that unify the risk management community with the climate adaptation community. And on that note, also the target that was announced by the United Nations Secretary General of universal coverage of every person on the planet with access to climate early warning is a very concrete, very tangible, very simple objective that I think really also plays into the benefits of autonomous adaptation. I mean, if you know that you're going to get hit by a flood or a drought or a storm, you have more options than when you do not have that information. And it's very similar, I think, with access to climate information systems. For example, when I look into food systems and their vulnerability, then another objective could be to cover every smallholder farmer on the world with access to climate information so that they can make better decisions about what to plant, when to plant, whether to plant at all. And I think this would then also de-risk the food systems that are under so much stress at the moment and that urgently require diversification but also risk proofing. So those would be, I think, a few ideas. Again, to my mind, it's very challenging to talk about a global goal of adaptation as long as we still have people dying of hunger after climate events that are largely predictable by now. And to my mind, this is the starting point for all the other conversations we should have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. No climate-induced famine on our watch. I think that's a very powerful message, and it's resonated quite a bit over the last several days, as has the message early warning for all. This is what saves lives as well. So it's my pleasure now to go to our last panelist, Raissa Ourea, who is going to be speaking in French. From Jeune Vert, Togo, Young Greens, Togo. And we'd really love to hear your perspective as someone who will be obviously interested in what the future brings for the young people when it comes to adaptation and the goal that's being set today. So please, the floor is yours, Raissa.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la modératrice. Alors, je m'appelle Raissa Ourea, je suis de Jeune Vert, également experte genre sur le projet Climate Smart Commune, un projet d'assistance pour la formulation des plans d'adaptation et d'atténuation. Alors, j'ai suivi avec beaucoup d'attention les interventions des panélistes précédents et il est clair qu'aujourd'hui, les catastrophes, quelle que soit leur origine, sont exacerbées par les phénomènes extrêmes des changements climatiques. Donc, si aujourd'hui nous voulons réduire de façon beaucoup plus considérable les catastrophes, nous devons agir sur les changements climatiques en proposant des actions d'adaptation dont on parle également, mais des actions d'adaptation adaptées à nos communautés. Le rapport du GIEC en début de cette année, je pense en février-mars, a mis un accent là-dessus où il fallait proposer, où la majorité des projets d'adaptation proposés aux communautés n'étaient pas adaptés à leurs coutumes, à leurs traditions, à leurs priorités, à leurs intérêts. Donc, il me semble aujourd'hui, pour avoir de l'impact beaucoup plus efficace, il faut impliquer nos communautés dans la mise en œuvre des projets, et ceci au début déjà à l'idée de projet, à la conception, à la planification, à la mise en œuvre. Il faut impliquer non seulement les communautés, mais également les autres parties prenantes, telles que les autorités locales, les ONG, la société civile. Ils doivent tous avoir leur point de vue et faire part de toutes les aléas dont ils ont eu à avoir tout au long de leur existence dans la communauté, que ce soit les femmes, les jeunes, les personnes en situation de handicap. Donc, moi, s'il faut avoir une action prioritaire, c'est l'implication de toutes les parties prenantes tout au long du processus, tout au long de la mise en œuvre du projet, avant, pendant et après les catastrophes. Il faut également se baser sur les actions basé sur les actions en lien avec les connaissances endogènes et locales que nous avons au sein de nos communautés. Et également je vais rejoindre également l'avis de Victoria sur le renforcement de capacité. Il faut investir sur le renforcement de capacité et pas que. Il faut également sensibiliser et communiquer suffisamment sur les changements climatiques et les catastrophes dans les communautés. Alors, en tant que jeune, je pense que pour moi, en tant que jeune et femme, pour moi, ce qui serait l'idéal, sur ce sur quoi on doit se baser pour pouvoir dire que nous sommes plus résilients, c'est le fait que d'ici quelques années, il n'y ait plus de déplacement, il n'y ait plus de migration des jeunes vers les villes ou vers l'Europe à la recherche d'une vie meilleure. Il faut pouvoir autonomiser les jeunes, leur donner les moyens de pouvoir se nourrir, de construire des bâtiments résilients et pouvoir développer leur communauté. Donc voilà ce que je peux dire sur sa question. Merci beaucoup.
Merci bien, and excellent. Really, I really take home the message that adaptation efforts really have to be adapted at the community level. They're not imposed on communities, but I also like that target, no more displacement, climate-induced displacement as well. I think that's also very, very critical. A big thank you to all of the panelists, and we now have some time for questions and answers. I have quite a few here already, but please, we do have the opportunity to ask questions from the floor. So if you would like to ask a question from the floor, raise your hand, and we will have our runners on either side hand you the microphone. But let me go maybe to some of the questions that we've received already. And let me start with the United States. Please, you spoke to us about, Victoria, about how we're working to build capacity at the local level, but you also spoke about a national resilience framework. So the question is, how are these two linked up? And how do you measure, or how are you going to measure success? Is it going to be at the local level or through the National Resilience Framework?
Thank you. So the measurement of resilience very much happens at the most local level, right? It's the ability of communities to survive, adapt, and thrive regardless of the shocks and stresses that they have, and certain conditions of well-being, of the capacity to be resilient being present. And so that's something that we're working with community partners to look at that local level. That said, at the national level, we very much, the way our frameworks work they're there to help us organize and partner better and to understand our roles and responsibilities. Mm-hmm. And so it's, the federal government, for instance, can support, and we have a responsibility to design and programs and invest resources that support communities to build resilience, but a federal government can't build community resilience. It's the people. It's the women, the youth, the neighbors, the people in a community that actually do that work. And so that's really the complement of the two, is we all have our roles and responsibilities. The National Resilience Framework, it's also an opportunity at the national level to figure out the role of the public sector, the private sector, civil society. How do we partner better in a more integrated fashion outside of the silos that we so often find ourselves in, whether it's because of a sector that we work in, or it's emergency management, or it's health. And so that's really how the two sides of that coin are going to be coming together.
Excellent. It's very clear. Thank you very much. Any questions from the floor? I think there is someone. Please introduce yourself and let us know who the question is for as well, please.
Hello. Yeah, so my name is Shirish from United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs, and my question is to our panelist, Pranava from Thailand. So you cited example of 2011 flood in Bangkok. Of course, it is because of climate change, but also there is a big reason that Bangkok is sinking. There is a land subsidence. So local risk plus climate change. So from 2011 to 2022 now, 9 years down, has any significant action been taken to mitigate climate change as well as something I'm talking about, the sinking city, Bangkok? Thank you.
Thank you very much. The sinking city of Bangkok.
Yes, and I'm actually a resident of Bangkok, and we had just a new elected governor in Bangkok, which have a very radical policy on how to prevent flooding and also sinking in Bangkok. So for us, is we do at the federal government on the headquarters, we are trying to do both in the measure, the structure measures for the prevention, as well as ecological and green measure to prevent the sinking also. Because not only just the sinking, is the erosion of the coastal area. And Bangkok itself, 200 years ago, it was not there. It was just a pile of mud that now is compiled, and now is have like a lot of buildings that all over it. So the sinking is happening. I can see from, even though my house is not like in the very near Port Harbor, but still I can see the cracking in the house without, we have to reinforce it. So what we are trying to do is the new government policy is they're trying to use both green preventions, using the ecological, the mangrove forest, the other coastal erosion measures, as well as structural, where it can divert water. So the water doesn't really come directly to Bangkok right away. So actually, I'm actually really curious about the new governor's policy on this, and I'm sure that once I learn more about it, I probably can give you more specific measures. But at the moment, I can just say that at the national level, we try to combine both structural as well as green structural measures on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Green structural interventions, excellent. Okay, we have another question over here, please. Please introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Michelle Yonatani from the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR. Thank you for a really fantastic round of presentations. When we're thinking about this global goal and adaptation, to make it meaningful, of course, it has to be really inclusive of the most marginalized people and communities around the world, those living in highly vulnerable situations, such as refugees and internally displaced people, people who are actually living in crisis already, not even just as a one-off or occasional thing, but as a chronic state of their existence, if you like. So would there be any further ideas from the panel, really any of the speakers, please, on what you think would be some of those key elements to make sure that that inclusion element is really part of the global goal? Thank you.
Absolutely. I think that's just a critical question. How do we reach those who are most likely to be left behind? And that is, of course, refugees, displaced people, people living in fragile context. Gerna, would you like to tackle this? And we'll ask others to also come on board.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a really important point. I think as a global society, we are only as safe as our most vulnerable members. No, everything starts basically with that concept of vulnerability. So if you have people who are in very high stages of vulnerability, then basically even a little disruption, no matter where it comes from, can turn a chronic situation into a very acute, life-threatening situation. And I think also, whenever we ask ourselves this question in the World Food Programme on, addressing these really extreme vulnerabilities in different countries, then we get thrown back to the fact that not every country is in the same situation, right? So you have countries that are in fully fledged conflict. You have countries that are in post-conflict rehabilitation situations. You have low-income countries where services do not always reach very remote communities. You have middle-income countries. And basically, the vulnerability situations or the different degrees of deprivation of the most vulnerable members of these societies, they are very different, no? So in the worst cases, people are deprived of literally everything. They have no access to natural resources, no access to means of production. They have no access to information, are disconnected from decision-making processes, no access to financial services. It's basically an almost universal degree of disenfranchisement. Well, when you go into different country contexts, then you see that maybe here people have access to financial services, and the natural resource base looks very good, but only basically the information piece is missing. So it comes down, to my mind, on really good diagnostics of vulnerability, understanding the drivers and the root causes of vulnerability, and then combining different initiatives, different sources of finance to then address these vulnerabilities in an integrated manner, rather than having one project that does one thing but forgets about 3 other important elements that are important for people's resilience. So maybe long answer to a very important question, and it may be oversimplified, but to me, proper vulnerability analysis, proper targeting, and collaboration across the nexus between humanitarian and development actors is really critical.
Thank you, Gernot. Would other panelists like to take a stab at this? Victoria, please.
Thank you. I think part of your question was also about chronic situations. And one of the things that we're very much focused on, in addition to vulnerability reduction, is understanding the impacts of climate change on a regular basis in people's lives. And so the example I'll give in the United States context is extreme heat. While we're currently responding to flooding more each year, more people die every year because of extreme heat, and it's a chronic issue, and it's one that our construction workforce, which is mainly African American, die at higher rates. Our people working in the fields and agriculture, mainly Latinos, dying at higher rates, underreported. And so that's another example of how climate change creates these chronic impacts that for us to address requires a different way of doing our normal business, not just our disaster risk reduction business, our emergency management business, but just how we support people's livelihoods. In the US, we don't yet have standards on how hot a workplace can get. We have them on how cold they can be. So there's just, the point I want to make is there's so many policy levers at our disposal that we can take today to take action on some of these chronic impacts that we're already experiencing in much higher rates.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's go on to the next question, and this is specifically related to the Netherlands experience. Now, the Netherlands has just tremendous expertise, and the question is, how are you sharing this expertise with other countries? And maybe let me add a dimension to that. How are you sharing that expertise with countries that may not have the same resources to manage it as the Netherlands has been able to do? So, please.
Thank you for the question. Very interesting. I think there are quite a number of bilateral relationships that the Netherlands is maintaining with a number of countries in the context of development cooperation. So a lot of the Dutch knowledge and experiences are shared in this context. But on the other hand, what I would also like to stress is that what we can learn from other countries is, in the Netherlands, we're in a way, our communities are a little bit spoiled because we've always had a government that took such good care of the water management in the Netherlands, resulting in a lot of people not being so aware of the situation that they're living in. And I think that's also where we can learn a lot from other countries where local communities have to deal with a lot of these issues themselves. So I don't want to just present this as a success story in the Netherlands, because we also have quite a lot of things to learn.
Thank you. So a question now I think I can ask Zita this question. We've talked a lot about needing to work at the local level. But the question is, are climate projections and climate science really reaching the local level? And are local authorities able to use this information effectively to design their urban planning for the future? We know just relying on disaster loss accounting and historical data is no longer enough. But is the climate science really there for local and community leaders to use?
So the answer is yes, but it takes some extra effort because the global projections needs to be downscaled and contextualized, and this is happening. So countries are developing regional plans which are responding to the downscaled forecast. I think the important part of it, how to translate these physical projections into something actionable, and here you need, I think, a lot more conversation between the scientists developing those projections and what does it mean. So I'm giving maybe just my experience from coastal settings. The discussions around sea level rise and the implications of sea level rise for planning are not so easy discussions, because you need to deal with the different projections under different climate scenarios, and the planning need to be adjusted to those uncertainties, and the communication of this uncertainty is sometimes challenging. So what we have been doing is basically to work with scenarios and develop respective plans, and what would that mean for a certain community or a certain region if sea level rise would develop in a certain way, and to basically come up with options which are adjustable, adaptable, which doesn't end up in a lock-in situation where the community or the region cannot readjust depending how sea level rise is developing. And I think this is certainly the case also for other kind of challenges for drought or rain, which is also more difficult to predict. But yeah, this conversation are really needed to translate the physical science into actionable knowledge, basically.
Thank you very much. I'm just checking, are there, yes, there's more questions from the floor, please. Can you pass the microphone there? Can you raise your hand? Got it, perfect.
Hi, I'm not sure, oh, yeah. I wanted to ask, what is the place of insurance in the global adaptation goal, given that it is an effective lever to bring in the private sector, and also in the context of the G7's commitment recently to the global climate shield? Sorry, I don't know who that's directed to.
Sure, no, and it's a great question. Risk transfer, insurance. Who would like to tackle it? Yusuf, would you like to maybe start, and then others may want to add?
Sure, I can start, and I think Zita can complement as
well.
Sure,
okay.
I mean, and perhaps I will address some of the questions that may have come through the Slido as well in the context of loss and damage, because we have a continuum here, actions that are taken preemptively, risk reduction actions, and then actions that are reactive, including early action beyond the incidence of an impact. And some that are sort of bridging the two, and insurance, I think, is one of those. And one of the trade-offs you have to deal with is that balance between sort of preemptive and contingent or reactive actions. Because you would not, I mean, you typically read in a paper after a disaster happens that all these losses were incurred and only X% was insured. There's sort of this implication that 100% should be insured, but then you read somewhere else that each dollar spent in prevention results in a dividend of anywhere between 4 and 21 benefits in reaction. So there's some optimal that has to be balanced between these, and obviously insurance is one of those. We have good schemes in the sovereign regional insurance schemes in Africa and the Caribbean, in the Pacific, and you one in Asia, which are operating very well in this regard. They're parametric insurance schemes. And as we progress in advancing the scaling up of adaptation and of loss and damage action, it will be incumbent on us to see where is the place, where are the boundaries, the most optimal size at which the international community can integrate insurance solutions as well as others within that continuum of response to climate change disasters and other impacts. So it certainly has its place, and it's already working, but sort of outside the holistic process of assessment that we have under the climate change process. So as we advance, I think we'll have to integrate it a bit better. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Zita, you also would like to respond to the insurance question?
Yeah, gladly, thanks. So I think insurance is a very important part of the solution, so to say, but it needs to be designed specifically fitting for this climate change context, so that it's, so to say, incentivize investment into resilience, so it's joined up, that it's designed in a way that is affordable for the most vulnerable too, and as a third remark, that at best joined up with public schemes like with adaptive social protection measures where insurance is, so to say, part of the suite of the solution, but not pushing for it alone, but in the context of an overall disaster risk reduction and adaptation strategy.
Okay, excellent. So it's part of the solution. It's not the only solution moving forward. If there are no other questions right now from the floor, let me go to a question that has come online for Raisa. So young people have been very vocal when it comes to climate action, and that's really helped move along the agenda. What role do you think they should play in setting the global goal on adaptation? Do you feel that your voices are being heard, or is there still room for improvement?
Merci pour la question. Alors, je pense que la voix des jeunes n'est pas assez attendue dans ce sens-là. Nous essayons vraiment, lors de nos projets, d'inclure ou de recueillir la voix des jeunes pour pouvoir permettre de le monter au plus haut, au niveau national, et le faire entendre. Aujourd'hui, la question primordiale en ce qui concerne les changements climatiques, c'est beaucoup plus l'autonomisation des jeunes. Les jeunes ne sont pas intéressés par rapport au changement climatique parce qu'ils n'ont pas d'emploi pour pouvoir survivre. Et je rejoins ce que a dit Guerno tout à l'heure. Il faut vraiment essayer d'éliminer, faire son possible pour éliminer la faim, permettre à chacun de pouvoir se nourrir. Et une fois que c'est fait, je pense que les jeunes pourront davantage mener des actions pour pouvoir être beaucoup plus résilients face au changement climatique. Donc c'est ce que je peux dire par rapport à la question. Voilà, merci.
So there's definitely still room for improvement. That's clear. There is another question that actually is for Yusuf, and it's a pretty straightforward question. Why do we need a global goal? Can we not just really try to advance at the local level and let that be our measurement for success?
Well, thank you for that question. I think we need both. So far, our M&E systems and our measurement of progress has been focused on where we are today versus yesterday. And that's really good because you can actually ascertain if you're moving in the right direction or not. Gernot told us about the progress in hunger statistics, that we were moving in the right direction, but then we reversed. But there's also that notion that you want to reach zero hunger. So that's a benchmark at the end where it's not just enough to see if you did 1% better than yesterday or not. You still might be well below the threshold that you need to be at. So that's why we need a global goal. We need to know where is that optimal state that we want to attain. Otherwise, we might suddenly be faced with a case of a tipping point or an irreversible level of damage with no capacity to respond because we've just been looking at incremental change compared to the past. So, so understanding again that the future will bring differing trends and might bring sort of quantum leaps in the needs for resilience is important, and understanding also the level that a society might need to attain in order to achieve its preparedness for these different levels of future impacts would also be important. So yes, it's important to be better than we were before, but then it's also important to gauge that progress against where you need to be. Otherwise, you might get a false sense of satisfaction from that incremental progress. Thanks.
Thank you very much. There are several questions here on loss and damage, but before I ask them, are there any other questions from the floor? So the questions that I have here is there seems to be a lot of momentum right now around loss and damage. What kind of opportunities do we see potentially on the horizon at COP27? And what are some of these very critical steps that need to be taken now to increase and maintain traction on loss and damage? Anybody want to take a stab? Gernot, please, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. You know, loss and damage is in a sense, a failure of climate change mitigation and a failure of climate change adaptation in time. So now we have these climate change related losses and damages. But I think we are in a difficult place in this conversation under the Climate Change Convention because it's a very polarized debate. And the debate polarizes also around finance. I think we need to, probably as a DRR community, infuse a solutions focus into the debate and pretty much say, we need to address, minimize, and anticipate losses and damages. And it doesn't really matter, which financial source, is creating or producing this solution. I mean, ultimately, the house is on fire, we need to start running with the buckets, no? And you don't really make a difference as whether the bucket is green or yellow or blue. So I think for COP27, I think from the humanitarian community, there's going to be a strong focus on solutions, basically showcasing what are effective projects that are already available or that have already been implemented, including in fragile countries, which do generally not receive sufficient climate finance in order to now address or reduce loss and damage. And so my short answer would be focus more and very concretely and very quickly on solutions on loss and damage. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Any other colleagues would like to address the loss and damage question? Yes, Zita? Anyone?
It's just a quick comment because I feel that the community dealing with loss and damage in the disaster risk reduction domain and under the UNFCCC are very segregated, and there is no exchange and discussion, at least not much. And I think that's really a lost opportunity. So following on what Gernot just said, I think maybe you as part of the DRR community feel free to engage more in the process, in the discussion under the UNFCCC, because as we heard before, so the overlap between the climate-related and other disaster-related losses are increasingly growing, and the trend will continue. So it's actually important that the conversation takes place and we are not discussing in silos.
Thank you. I have one question in the back and then one in the front. So let's go first to a colleague in the back. Please.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. This question is with regards to the joint action plan towards COP27. I'm wondering whether is there any monitoring mechanisms on the INDCs, which each country had submitted in the year 2015 in Paris, whether any review or monitoring mechanism that has been done so that there could be joint action further to see the Paris Agreement being implemented. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yusuf, would you like to answer that, please?
Yes, thank you. I mean, as you might know, the Paris Agreement is a pledge and review system, so part of the review is looking at the NDCs, which are the pledges from countries, to see collectively where they take us. So yes, we did have a synthesis of the NDCs last year, and there was a call for repeating that annually as we go forward. So yeah, last year's synthesis showed that we still have a way to go to be consistent with where the science is telling us we have to be in terms of levels of emissions. So we will keep synthesizing the NDCs to assess their impact on achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement as we go forward periodically, much more frequently than in the past. And so that is sort of the instrument by which we will be looking at that, synthesis reports. And then every 5 years, we will have this huge assessment, the global stocktake, for 3 issues. One is greenhouse gas mitigation, and the second is adaptation. The third is means of implementation, which is finance, technology, and capacity building, also to measure progress on these compared to the ultimate goals of the Paris Agreement. So the first one will happen in 2023, then the second one 2028, then 2033, etc. So that's the mechanism for monitoring and assessing progress, upon which then the international system can look at the aggregate level of progress and decide if more needs to be done or if we need to change course. Thank you.
Thank you, Yusuf. Okay, we'll take our question here. Can you bring the microphone in the front, please?
Merci beaucoup. Merci pour vos interventions.
Huh?
Et moi, j'ai une question, c'est par rapport à la gestion des risques. Et nous travaillons dans une zone sensible, donc j'aimerais... Quels sont les mécanismes à mettre en place pour la gestion des risques en termes de mouvement de population? Et étant donné qu'aujourd'hui, si on parle de la gestion des risques, il y a beaucoup de choses qu'on regarde en termes de stratégie. Si beaucoup de normes mettent le plan de contingence et ils créent des task forces pour pouvoir travailler. Et cela aussi n'empêche pas qu'on mette en place ce qu'on appelle le plan d'action communautaire d'adaptation, où nous avons accès à des aléas climatiques qui nous permettent de quitter de l'urgence en exercice humanitaire. Maintenant, ma question, comme je viens de le demander, c'est ça, j'aimerais savoir quels sont les mécanismes. Parce que s'il y a l'inondation qui est venue comme un aléa climatique dans une zone sensible où nous travaillons, et l'inondation accompagnée avec le choléra qui était venu, et il y a un mouvement, cela veut dire s'il y a des mouvements de population en termes de réfugiés. Quels sont les mécanismes que nous pourrons mettre en place dans ce sens? Merci.
Okay, thank you very much. Who would like to try to tackle this question? Were you able to hear it? Yes, Victoria, please. No, you didn't. Okay. Anybody else would like to try? Gernot, please, go ahead.
Yeah, just maybe one quick reflection, and we had a panel this morning on the nexus between humanitarian and development action, and there was a similar question about how we can manage these risks of displacement, and one aspect that I think is important here is then whenever humanitarian action is in the field, then you have different, generally when we have population movements, right, when people get displaced, then we are in a humanitarian situation. These people are, like Michel has said, very, very vulnerable, very exposed, but we try in the humanitarian community to also provide support that reduces tensions between displaced people and hosting communities. For example, by providing cash transfers, which then displaced populations can spend in the local economy, which in turn reduces the risks of conflict. So this is one lever on which we can steer risk management, and this is especially, I would say, managing risk of social tensions and violent conflicts in this space.
Okay, thank you very much. And I hope that answered your question. Please, let's go to the front here and take this question. You've got the mic, great.
Hi, with greetings everyone. Thank you for a really interesting discussion. I'm Ken O'Flaherty, the COP26 Regional Ambassador for the UK. A comment and a question, if I may, on the question earlier about COP27. I just want to underline, I think from our perspective as ongoing presidency, the importance of donors meeting their commitments to double adaptation finance by 2025. Perhaps an incitation as well to the crowd. You also mentioned the need to ensure join up between the disaster risk community and the climate change community in the discussion around loss and damage. I think this creation of the Santiago network is particularly important there, and we would strongly encourage experts who have technical expertise to offer to join the Santiago network. By all means, contact the UK government if you want information on how to do that. But my question, I think perhaps more for Nassif, but others may have a view. We know now that many countries are developing national adaptation plans, and we currently expect many of those to be ready for COP27. Are there lessons from this discussion today and indeed across the week on lessons that governments should be taking on how to design those plans, noting the discussion today? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yusuf?
Yes, the National Adaptation Plan process was a product of our 16th session of the Conference of the Parties in Cancun, so it's a while back. And now, as of now, we have 36 submitted plans, which is a small percentage of the whole group of developing countries. Among these, I believe 13 have come from least developed countries. And we've been engaging with UNDRR over the past year or two on how to make sure that at the national level, the support, the technical support through the UNFCCC should also engage with the national DRR community to make sure that their views are taken into account and the experiences and lessons that the DRR community has amassed for a very long time. So this is ongoing. And we've heard here in so many of the sessions the importance of building better bridges between the climate change, the adaptation community, and the DRR community at national level. So I think it's a strong reminder that we need to do better on that. And as you said, the NAP process is the one instrument that we have that is sort of the formal channel for prioritizing adaptation needs and a conduit for support. There is a mandate for the Green Climate Fund to support both the formulation of national adaptation plans and the subsequent implementation of the priority projects identified therein. So it's a very good opportunity for synergy between the DRR community and the climate adaptation community. And I hope we can really intensify our efforts in strengthening the relationship between the two communities. Yeah.
Absolutely, and from UNDRR side, if I may, we completely agree. We are working very hard now with UNFCCC to see far more integrated approaches. And do let me use this occasion to really encourage DRR practitioners to contribute to the Santiago network, which is aiming to provide technical assistance to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. We are one. We don't need to be operating in silos. We only have a few minutes left, so what I would like to do is very quickly give 1 minute or less even to each panelist to really give some final reflections as UNFCCC with the parties, with the stakeholders, move towards defining this really critically important global goal on adaptation. What is your parting recommendation? And may I start please with Victoria?
My parting recommendation for those who are in the disaster risk management space is to really embrace our role as lead coordinators, because we can't know everything, but we understand vulnerability, we understand exposure, we understand risk, and that's going to be critical for the work ahead. So we may not know everything, but we are lead coordinators and have a lot of work to do.
Fabulous. We need to bring people together. Okay, Judith, the global goal on adaptation.
I'm going to cheat because I have two recommendations that I want to bring you to your attention. One is that if we really want to become more resilient and work on adaptation, we really need to break down these silos and look at agriculture, the energy sector, housing, nature, and population growth. And I really want to stress that water and soil should be guiding principles in looking at these different sectors. And second of all, I talked a little bit about extreme events and consecutive events. Sometimes I have the feeling that we think we are preparing for the future, but that future is already here now. And I really want to work together with you on increasing our understanding on these phenomena. Thank you.
Absolutely, the future is here now. Okay, so please now, the Thailand experience and your recommendation, Panapa.
Thank you. Actually, I want to focusing more on the anticipatory actions. The anticipatory action contribute to risk reduction prior to hazard event, and disaster risk reduction is actually the first step toward the climate change adaptation. However, there's the remaining gaps between the short-term resilience and underlying emphasis on early warning system and early actions in anticipatory of extreme weather events. A long-term resilience which require an investment in adaptation beyond early warning system and early actions. For risks to evolve in resilience, a parallel shift in mindset need to take place is anticipatory thinking and early actions. For short-term resilience must be complemented by a long-term resilient thinking. Through the investment and adaptation in changing climate disaster risk, this resilient thinking mindset need to become a norm among all the sector and stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Zita, please.
I would like to draw once more the attention to the global commons. So I think if we are thinking about global adaptation, there has to be some voice for the global commons. But if you take a step back and you just look at the national adaptation plans, I believe so that those needs to have also an assessment of the cascading impacts of national adaptation. So my solution might be your problem. And this is what we need to acknowledge. Just a very simple example, if we have a river basin and I'm building a dam, that will have an impact downstream. And this is just a simple one, but we have much more of these, and we need to look at those. Thank you.
Thank you, Zita. Raissa, please, a final recommendation or thought.
Alors, comme je le disais, il faut nécessairement impliquer les communautés parce qu'elles sont les plus vulnérables et ce sont eux qui sont face aux changements climatiques, aux effets des changements climatiques. C'est un processus, l'implication de ces communautés, c'est un processus très long, parfois coûteux, mais cela garantit ou accélère, donne une meilleure chance de réussite du projet, une meilleure résilience aux communautés. Ça a été déjà essayé lors d'un programme vue de fonds mis en place par GNDR et nous avons des succès. Donc, impliquer massivement toutes les parties prenantes des communautés, cela garantit ou accélère une meilleure résilience des communautés. Merci.
Thank you. Merci, Raissa. And Gerno, please.
I would like to emphasize that, again, probably, that as a global community, we are only as resilient as our most vulnerable members. So I would recommend that as a baseline for the global goal on adaptation, we should consider people who are in currently very high stages of vulnerability. Thanks.
Absolutely. So we have a very hard finish right now. So first of all, let me please thank the panel, thank the participants for your incredibly insightful questions. And I think we really are walking away with an understanding that the future is here now, that we have to invest in our communities to better understand and to manage risks, and we have to put emphasis on those contexts where currently populations are facing food insecurity. We're staring down the barrel of potential famine, and we cannot leave those communities behind as we build adaptation and resilience. Thank you all very much, and please enjoy the closing ceremony. Bye-bye.
Thank you.